Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Erin Young, author of the new novel, The Fields. And Erin has published best-selling historical novels under the name Robin Young. Erin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hello.
Sure. Well, if someone hasn't yet heard about your new novel, The Fields, how would you describe the novel?
Well, it's a crime thriller, definitely a police procedural, but it does have a few little sort of kinks in it that make it a little bit different. One of my agents describes it as more of a sort of techno thriller in a way.
And do you remember the original idea or impetus that led you to write The Fields?
Yeah, it was pretty much 5 years ago to the day, actually, that I had the idea. I was reading an article in a British newspaper, which was talking about the sort of power of big agriculture and some of the sort of issues around that and around over farming specifically. And it was actually it sounds a bit boring, but it was actually quite an unsettling article. And I just had this sort of lightning bolt kind of what if moment, and that's really when the novel was born, but it took a lot longer than that to actually get it to this point.
Well, if someone listening isn't aware, the book is set in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the research process, given that I'm assuming that you're British, in researching the novel that's set in Iowa, The Fields.
Yeah, as you can probably tell, I'm not from around there. Yeah, it was, I mean, given the sort of nature of the initial idea, I knew it had to be somewhere with very strong agricultural links, and where that really formed, a huge part of the landscape and the culture. And the first thing I did when I had the idea and kind of thought this could make a good novel, was to look up specifically where is the world's biggest corn growing area. And the biggest corn grower is America. And then in America, Iowa comes out on top. So, I had the idea, I got the right location. But, having never been there and really knowing very little about it when I started on this journey, I thought I'd better go out there. So I did. I spent a couple of weeks in Iowa, kind of traveling across the state, really, in the summer of 2018, which is really when I started to kind of get to grips with what this novel was going to be and the characters and the flavor of it.
And I'm curious, did you have any Iowans read the novel before it was published?
Only in recent months. So, kind of gone through most of the publication process. We've had, in fact, my marketing person at Flatiron, who's publishing in the States, another Erin, actually, she is from Iowa. And so it was really good to get her sort of take on it. And a couple of other people have cropped up recently in the sort of early reviews and have been kind of surprised, actually, that I'm not from there. So I think I've done as solid a job as I can of getting it right.
It sounds like you probably did. So I'm curious, what was that process like for you? Did it kind of did it present any specific issues or problems writing an entire novel that's set in Iowa that you had not visited before your 2-week trip?
I mean, in a sense, occasionally, yeah, there were definitely challenges to overcome with that. But I think really having been writing historical novels since, I was first published in 2006. But, my first novel was, pretty much 7 years in the making for me. So, I'm terrible at maths, but it's quite a long time writing historical fiction. And, I really learned over the years writing that to really get to grips with the world that I'm writing about. Because often I was writing about cultures and people and places and ideas and, all kinds of things that were completely alien to me, really. And so I think that really stood me in quite good stead as understanding just how deep down into the ground, if you like, of this place and the people that live there and the landscape, all the way down to the working out what trees and plants grow there and, what people eat and what they do on a Saturday night. And it's really important in a historical novel to get all of that right. And so I felt, even more so actually to get it right in this novel because, it's contemporary and people really do live there. And I've kept a lot of I've changed a lot of the businesses and things and invented some things, but, the places are real, that I've set the novel in. So it was really important to me to get as much right as I could.
That's great. So what is it about your protagonist, Riley Fisher, in the novel The Fields that appeals to you?
Well, surprisingly, she's the first female protagonist I've ever had. I've always written from a male perspective. So that was kind of interesting for me, and a new sort of voice and a new kind of challenge, even though I'm a woman myself. You would think that might be easier, but I don't know, in some ways, maybe it wasn't. And she's got sort of contemporary preoccupations that, myself and a lot of my female friends of my age and not too far from Riley's age are. And so in a way, she's more familiar to me. But in another way, I suppose in some senses, that's a little bit more exposing, maybe. I like the way that she is kind of this buttoned up woman who doesn't, for various reasons, much of which come from her past, she doesn't really let people get that close to her. But slowly over the course of the novel, you sort of see the kind of cracks starting to show and you see how vulnerable she is, but also in that there is strength, which I hope is coming across as well. So it's sort of starting out as this very sort of buttoned up kind of straight-laced woman, and you slowly start to see the past that she's lived kind of come through in those cracks.
Sure. And I'm curious, are you planning more novels featuring Riley?
I am. I'm actually in the middle of a second novel at the moment, which is due to be delivered in a couple of months' time. So I'm kind of right in the heart of that at the moment. I think the plan would be to publish that next year. So yeah, I'm quite excited that I've been given the opportunity to carry on with her.
That's great. And will that one be set in Iowa as well?
It is. It's in a slightly different place. It's actually going to be more set in Des Moines, so in the capital city. And this time in the fields, it's summer, so it's very stifling. It's very humid, lots of kind of chatter of bugs and birds, and which is very much what it was like when I was out there. But this one is in the depths of winter, so it's a very, very different atmosphere.
Well, earlier you mentioned your first novel, I think you said was a 7-year kind of journey and project. What was your writing journey that led you to writing and getting your first novel published?
So it was a long one. I had written, I've always written really since I can remember. My dad taught me to read when I was 3, so books and stories were a really prominent part of my childhood and was something that not only did I enjoy losing myself in, but it was the one thing I was good at school, was writing and storytelling. So, and I was also lucky enough to have a really good teacher who kind of brought that out of me and gave me a lot more confidence. So I was sort of writing poetry and short stories through my teens, and I kind of thought at some point I'd end up being a journalist, but that didn't happen. And I wrote 2 novels, fantasy novels, huge. One was 350,000 words long.
Wow.
I know. I was in a full-time job as well, so I was writing in my lunch breaks and, after work. And it was just that sort of kind of, I guess, outpouring, but it really, there was a lot of bad stuff that needed to come out before I could get anywhere near actually writing something half decent. So yeah, the 2 fantasy novels went on the shelf. I did a evening class in creative writing at my local university here. And that's around the time that I had the idea for my first novel, Brethren, which is set during the Crusades and follows the Knights Templar. And that was actually before Dan Brown had the Da Vinci Code out. And I kind of thought I was telling this completely undiscovered story and that nobody knew anything about it. And then the Da Vinci Code came out about a year, I think, before I was then sending it to agents and publishers. But that actually, I mean, by the time I'd finished it, that subject had sort of hit the zeitgeist. So it wasn't a bad bit of timing. But no, it took that course and then a master's degree in creative writing where I kind of kept on at that novel and really kind of kicked it into shape. I've got probably 13 drafts of it on my computer, so it was definitely a long labour. And while I was on the master's degree, I met my agent, who became my agent for quite a long time. And we sent off to publishers. We got 12 rejections, but we got 3 letters back saying basically we like what's here, it just needs more editing. And so I quit my teaching job at the time and rewrote it again, probably the 13th time, I think. And we got a deal. In fact, it went into an auction between 2 publishing houses the following year. So it was, it was a long time coming, but it paid off in the end.
That's great. I'm curious, what was your writing process when you were working on the fields? You talked about reading this article and learning about big agriculture. Did you end up, are you an outliner? Did you plan the novel extensively before you started writing, or did you just dive into the narrative? What's your process?
Oh, I'm a huge outliner. I've got a lot of novelist friends and that I've made over the years, and we often compare our processes. And I'm probably at the, like the red end of the scale in terms of plotting. I'm right there. The needle is on the line. I don't feel confident enough if I don't know where the story is going and the beginning and the middle and the end. I just need to know before I start. The only time I ever tried it differently, and I think sometimes after writing for this long, it's good to try something new. But I did with my the last historical novel I wrote before I wrote The Fields, and I tried to just go for it and see what happened. I mean, I had an idea of the characters and where it was going to be set and some of the big themes, but basically all my characters ended up in a tavern in the south of France, and they kind of stayed there for, I don't know, about 40,000 words, and I was just deadly bored by that. I just didn't know where to take them, so I had to pretty much cut everything that I'd written, go back to the drawing board, and then do the plot, which, for me, when I plot, they tend to be anywhere between sort of 20 and 50,000 words long themselves. So not that far off a novel. But what I tend to do is sort of sketch it all out, get all of my research down, get all the details, do little kind of character biographies and that kind of thing, which, they're never set in stone. I mean, most of the time it's never exactly like I planned it, because the characters go off and kind of do their own thing, which is what you want them to do. But yeah, I just knowing that I have a map, I feel a lot more settled. And I tend to just do a lot of free writing in those early stages, which is kind of unlike how I actually write, which is for me just a very painstaking process. I hate having sort of kind of crappy sort of chapters behind me. I like it to be as polished as it can be all the way through. So I'm constantly going back over what I've written and editing and rereading and changing. So usually by the end of the process, it is a fairly polished novel, which of course will then be ripped apart by my editors. But it feels kind of polished to me at that point, which is, I just wouldn't want to send it to anyone in any other state. But I've got a lot of novelist friends and some of them would be appalled by that. And, they just want to start at page 1 and just get through it. And sometimes some of them even start somewhere in the middle at a random scene and then go back. And I have no idea how they managed to do that without going insane. That would just not work for me at all.
Sure. Well, you mentioned these 2 kind of gigantic fantasy novels that you said you put on the shelf as you moved on to historical novels. Have you ever thought about going back and seeing if you could resuscitate those fantasy novels?
I think in the past I did, but they would just take so much work, really. Just so much work. Although thinking about it, if it's a 350,000 word one at the start, then maybe there's like 4 novels there or something.
Maybe.
No, I think I'm good with the historical novels, and I'm really excited about writing these new ones.
That's great. Well, what writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories or novels?
Goodness, I always feel like there's sort of so much to say, but at the same time, it's such a personal thing. I think the one thing that really helped me and really moved me along in my own writing journey and made me a better writer gradually was sharing it with other writers. I think for me, that was really the key part of the master's degree was we had this small group of, I think there was 10 of us, all wanting to be, professional writers, all very serious about it, all writing completely different things. And we basically spent our days tearing each other's novels apart or our poems apart or our plays apart. Actually in a very constructive way, but sure. There was no fear of actually saying, that's not good or that's not right. And actually in doing that, in editing other people's work, we really learned to edit our own. We'd have our own voices in our minds then when we were writing, kind of having pulled other people up on doing, something so cliched earlier that day or whatever. So I think probably for me, the editing was something that I learned very early on, that, what you think is your final draft is really not, if you want to do something with it, if you want to put it out there. And particularly if you want to go down the traditional routes of publishing and through agents and publishers, it's, in some ways we're kind of protecting ourselves in not knowing just, what a tough kind of process that is and how many edits you might have to get through. But at the same time, I think it's worth knowing and kind of being a bit realistic about that. And also, I've had friends in the past who have sent things off to agents and they've got letters back basically saying, really liked your character or really liked your idea, but, it really does need some more work. Here's some ideas. And they've kind of come to me and said, well, that's a rejection, isn't it? And it's kind of like, well, actually, no, if an agent really is, writing to you and kind of suggesting some things, then if you can sort of see what they're saying and you agree with them, and I would always say take a couple of days or even a couple of weeks just to sort of sit there, because your initial reaction is, oh my God, no, I don't agree at all. And then it's sort of you go back and you think, yeah, actually I kind of think a good agent and a good editor is someone who kind of just comes into the room, just steps into the room and just turns the light on for you. And there you are sort of scrabbling about in the dark. And then suddenly you can see the kind of mess that you've made in there and you can start putting things in their proper places. So I just think they're kind of light bulbs for me, agents and editors. And if you get a good one and if you get any feedback, then for me, jump on it and seize it and do something about it. That's what I'd say.
That's great. Well, what novels or nonfiction books have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Oh, goodness. I'm reading quite a lot at the moment, but I think where I'm also writing most days, they sort of go into my head and then go straight out again. And then I forget what I've just read. Let me think. I still read quite a bit of historical fiction, but I really do like kind of crime thrillers of historical fiction. I read Daughters of Night by Laura Shepherd Robinson, who's a British author, set in Georgian England, which is just, it's got all of this kind of lovely, evocative kind of detail on the page that you can sort of smell Georgian London, which, you know, really isn't that nice most of the time. But it's beautifully written. And We Begin at the End, which is by another British author. I think it's Christopher Whitaker or Chris Whitaker. I think that might have come out there last year. I thought that was a wonderful telling of a kind of police procedural, but really quite different. And I kind of dive in and out of TV as well. I think with streaming being so different these days, I think a lot of writers kind of, there's a sort of, you know, we talk amongst ourselves and there's a sort of guilty feeling about, oh God, we're watching so much Netflix or whatever and not doing lots of reading. But I think these days with those sorts of shows, there's so much in the plotting and the writing that also is incredibly useful as a reminder of what works and sometimes what doesn't as a writer.
Sure. Well, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your new novel, The Fields?
So I have a website, which is erinyoungauthor.com. And then I'm on Twitter as well it's at Erin Young Author. So I'm on Facebook as well, but for some reason they won't let me change my name. So I'm there as Robin Young Author. So
that's great.
Confusing people everywhere.
Sure. Well, again, we've been speaking with Erin Young, author of the new crime novel, The Fields. She also writes best-selling historical novels under the name Robin Young. The Fields is on sale now, so go buy a copy at your local independent bookstore. And Erin, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Now, stay tuned from a brief excerpt of the audiobook of The Fields by Erin Young, narrated by Sonila Nankani. Available from Macmillan Audio, wherever audiobooks are sold.
She ran without thinking, without direction, desperation driving her deep into the fields. The endless rows of corn were an oppressive labyrinth, ripe heads bowing above her, snagging her hair. Blades whipped her palms as she thrashed through the towering stalks, not looking back. She stumbled on rutted ground, dry soil crumbling beneath her feet. Her sneaker, shucked half off her heel, slipped from her foot. She let it go, the earth spiking through her sock. Blood thrummed in her ears. The night was clotted with clouds, the darkness pressing. She could feel the pollen erupting around her, gritting her eyes. Her mother's voice sing-songed in her mind. "Don't forget your meds, sweetheart." A sob burst between her breaths. Her lungs were burning. The thrumming in her ears was louder. Something out there, coming closer. She felt a fresh stab of terror as light smeared the shadows, the knotted canopy shimmering green above her. She threw herself down, curling around the brace roots, eyes squeezed shut. The drones circled overhead, whining like a dentist's drill. Her eyelids were rinsed with a pallid glow. Slowly it passed, strobing the fields. Was that a shout she'd heard beneath its fading hum? Low growl of an engine in the distance? She curled herself tighter into stillness, at one with the roots and the soil. A mouse hiding from a hawk. As her breath slowed, the pain, kept at bay by adrenaline, came on. There were points of it across her body. The back of her skull struck so hard her vision had exploded with light. 2 fingers of her left hand where she'd fallen, bending back with a nauseating snap. Her thigh, where the flimsy cotton of her clothes had been ripped open. But worst of all was her neck, where the pain was concentrating in a burning pool. She went to touch her throat, but flinched when her fingers slid into something slick and pulpy. Her t-shirt was soaked. She had thought it was sweat, the night air so close she could barely breathe. But she could smell the blood now. Warm metal, iron and rust. Sparks of memory. A tumble from her bike, knees split open on blistering asphalt. Her uncle's slaughterhouse in Fayette. Squeals of half-stunned hogs and arcing blades. Red beads on her palm, welling at the razor's sting. Hot press of another hand to hers. Her whole body was shaking, teeth chattering. She knew she should get up, but her limbs were leaden. Her breath quickened. The darkness swayed in front of her, a murmur of wind to shiver the corn. There was laughter in her mind. The fields, waist-high with spring crops, rippled before her as she ran. He was behind her, coming up fast. The delicious shock of his arms catching around her waist, her laugh ending in a shriek as she was lifted into the air, his lips on hers, salt sweat and corn dust, desire striking a bell inside her. James.
Thank you for listening to this clip provided to you by Macmillan Audio. To hear more, look for this title wherever audiobooks are sold.
Winter can wreak havoc on your skin. Hey, it's Kayla, and it's not just the weather, but as a new mom, I've seen my skin change in ways that I'm not too happy about. But that's where the Skin Center has you covered. Their most popular treatment is Botox because they're the best at it. They've been ranked a top 10 provider in the nation by Allergan Aesthetics, the makers of Botox. And their best facial is what I got. It's the HydraFacial. It exfoliates, extracts, and hydrates all at once. So save your skin from these winter blues and DM at the Skin Center MD on Instagram and mention code Kayla to get $100 off your first Botox or filler treatment or any skincare package.